You're probably familiar with Windlass. While they can make some good swords, I'm personally not generally a fan of their blades. But for the final video in this Type 14 series, let's take a look at one of their most popular models. Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTube, and today I'm going to be reviewing this Windlass Oakeshott Type 14 sword, which is on loan to me by sword friend Ryan. Thank you, Ryan, for your generosity. Before going any further, I want to stress that this is a well-used sword. It's got a good amount of wear and patina on it, and that's because Ryan has used it quite a bit. So this is not representative of what you would get if you ordered it new. And from there, I'm not going to harp on the finish or little flaws in the sword any further. Brand new, this sword is listed at roughly $300 from museum replicas. It used to be cheaper, but there's been some price increases recently. Windlass is based in India, and they produce a wide variety of swords, for sale both under their name, Windlass, and contracted out to other companies. For instance, Cold Steel uses them for a lot of their blades, and Balor Arms of Cult of Athena now uses them as well. Historically, Windlass has sold their swords as blunt by default, and then you would pay for sharpening afterwards. There's been at least some reports that they are coming sharp without having to pay for that additional fee, but I don't know how true that is for every model. Now, Windlass typically stays in the budget range of swords. I would say roughly $200 to $350, although there are outliers. For their European swords, they usually get the profile of a sword correct, but then more of the subtle nuances are lost, such as the correct cross-section and the correct thickness. Windlass typically uses a pretty thin stock, around 4.5 to 5 millimeters. And while that works for some sword types, it doesn't work for all. And that can lead to swords that don't quite handle correctly. I've already talked about the Type 14 typology in this series, so just a couple quick notes. I would say that this sword nails the profile of a Type 14. It starts very broad, has a nice even taper, and then goes into an acute point. As I mentioned in the Kingston Arms review a couple weeks ago, Mr. Oakeshott describes the cross-section of a Type 14 as lenticular, although some have a soft central ridge. And this Windlass does have a very soft central ridge, softer than the Kingston Arms, and I think that's actually close enough to a lenticular that it actually works. Another interesting thing is that Type 14 swords are typically a pretty short sword, roughly 28 to 30 inches, probably closer to 30. This Windlass is 26 inches. That's almost a quarter shorter than what a Type 14 would normally be. So this is quite short. In case it wasn't clear, what I meant by that is 4 inches shorter is roughly 25% of the typical 30-inch length. So like most Windlass swords, this comes with a leather sheath. It has a metal shape and a metal collar, and it's just leather. There's no wood core to it. There's a lot of rattle, you can hear that. There's not going to be any retention really. And because this is just leather, not wood core, it doesn't provide any long-term storage potential. If you put an oiled blade into leather, the leather will start soaking up that oil, which is not good for the steel and not good for the leather. Now personally, I'm not much of a fan of these sheaths. I just don't think they're worth it. I would rather see Windlass do a couple things actually. They could add to the price of the sword and make this a proper wood core scabbard. That would be my preference personally. They could remove this sheath and put whatever it costs into making the sword a little bit better. Or they could remove the sheath and just make the sword a little bit cheaper. Any of those I think would be better than including this pretty much worthless sheath. I don't see really any value in this. The pommel is representative of an Oakeshott Type J with a raised center boss with a recess in it that you could insert a coin or something. I think that would really improve the look of the sword. It's a little big, a little oversized, what I would say, especially if you compare it to the Kingston Arms. I'll put a comparison up here. The Kingston Arms pommel was a little on the small side. I think the Windlass is a little on the large size. Right in between would be a good shape in my opinion. It is peen to the tang, and the peen is pretty sloppy. This is absolutely normal for Windlass. Nice thing is it's all chamfered nicely. I can rest my hand, I can rest the pommel in my hand and it doesn't bite into me when my swing. There are a few ledges at the transition to the grip, but I don't feel them at all. So it's a good, effective pommel. I would like to see, I said this on the Kingston Arms review, I would say it on this one, I would like to see some more dimension to this pommel. Maybe start a little bit thicker here and then just taper it out a little bit, just to give a little bit more flair to the pommel, and because that actually was historical. That's how most pommels historically were designed. The grip is absolutely typical for Windlass. It is a very bare bones grip with a wood core, a very simple leather wrap, and prominent stitches on the seam. One thing I can say is that Windlass swords I've used in the past, typically the stitching is very prominent and a bit rough and unpleasant. I think this one has been used enough that the stitching has been worn down a little bit. It's not rough at all, and it doesn't feel bad in the hands at all. And personally, I would like to see some cord wrap texture on here. It doesn't add a ton of time or expense, and it just really makes a grip feel and look better. And then a couple risers would be nice as well. But even with that, the grip is effective. It feels good in the hand. I have no problem indexing the blade, and that's really the most important thing, right? The crossguard isn't really representative of any specific Oakeshott typology. I would say what it most reminds me of is somebody who has seen pictures of medieval swords, what they would design a crossguard to be. There's absolutely no dimension to it in terms of like tapering or complexity. It's just a flat, thick, chunky steel bar that has a little bit of rounded nature to it. Frankly, I find it just a little bit unattractive because it's just not got enough nuance to it. You don't need a lot of nuance in a budget sword, but there should be some taper in here, maybe a little bit of a chamfer at a corner, just to make sure, just to give it a little bit more touch, lessen the weight a little bit. That said, it's not sharp on any of the edges. All the corners have been chamfered enough so that I could finger the guard if I wanted to. I don't want to because it's actually pretty sharp there. But it works. It's just a little bland, a little chunky, a little boring. The gap in the crossguard also is quite large, which frankly is very common for Windlass. And while it doesn't affect the functionality, it's a bit of an eyesore. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So this sword starts at 4.5 millimeters thick and features very little distal taper. It gets a little bit thinner, down to around 3 3/4 millimeters, right around the near end of the fuller. And then towards the very end of the blade, it does taper down to about 2.5 millimeters. But overall, this leads to a very stiff sword. I can barely flex this at all. And that's a little bit stiffer than you would expect out of this type of sword. As I mentioned earlier, though, the profile just absolutely nails a Type 14 in my opinion. It has that broad blade at the crossguard, nice even taper all the way down to a nicely acute point. I do actually really like the look of the blade here. It screams Type 14. And personally, there's something about Type 14's blade profile that I just find incredibly aesthetically pleasing. The fullers run about 2/3 of the way down the blade, and the edges waver here and there. They're not perfectly straight, and across the entire blade there is a lot of rippling on the surface, which honestly is not very unexpected at this price point. Windlass is not going to put a lot of time into perfecting the finish so that there's no rippling, because they're not interested in that. They're trying to keep the price low so that people can afford their swords. As I said earlier, Windlass does make their swords blunt by default, which does mean the edge geometry is not going to be as good as, for instance, the Albion or the Kingston Arms. Because they don't grind it too sharp by default, there's going to be a steeper secondary bevel here on the edge, which makes cutting a little bit worse. That said, the secondary bevel on this is actually pretty well done. It's fairly small. I can definitely feel the change in the geometry, but it's not an abrupt change. It's actually pretty well done. And that brings me to testing the edge. Let's take a look at some paper cutting here. So insert it in. I'm just going to let the sword do the cutting here. That's very smooth, actually. Yeah, so this is actually sharpened very nicely. Now, there's been some discussion online recently about sword sharpness, paper cutting, water bottle cutting, the kind of stuff I do. And no, swords were not designed ever to cut paper, to cut water bottles. I mean, in history they didn't have plastic. Check out this video, linked here, for more of my thoughts on sharpness. Time to talk about some handling. So this windlass weighs around 2 3/4 pounds if I remember right, and it feels it. It's a pretty short blade at about 26 inches, so that's quite a bit of mass for such a relatively short blade. So when I put it out there, I feel it. Like if I want to stop the cut, even at this slower speed, I feel that weight fighting me, stopping the cut. Whereas if I continue the motion, that feels a lot better. So yeah, this does not feel like a sword that you really want to do really accurate short cuts that stop. It feels like you want to kind of just keep using the momentum of your swings to keep the sword in motion so that it doesn't drag on your joints with that extra weight. It's not out of the realm of possibility for a sword of this length to be this weight historically, but it is certainly on the high side. And what causes that is the fact that there's so little distal taper in this sword, so the blade is rather meaty, and then Windlass adds a pretty chunky crossguard and pommel, adding to the weight overall. They do that so that the balance point stays good. The balance point on this is around 4 inches, and that's perfectly fine. That's actually a pretty close to the crossguard balance point for this type of sword. But to get that balance point, they have to add more weight to the hilt because their blade's heavier, and it just all adds up into something of a bit of a clunky sword. It's not egregiously so. I can still move it around. I still had some good cuts. I can redirect a cut decently, but again, when I'm starting the momentum, if I have to then change the momentum, I immediately feel that in my arm a little bit. And that's not the best feeling in the world. But we're not talking terrible here. It's just, when I compare this to something like that Kingston Arms sword I reviewed 2 weeks ago, or even the Solingen about a month ago, both of those felt far more nimble than this Windlass does. And that's to be expected with Windlass. They're a budget brand, and they don't put a ton of depth and nuance into their swords. They keep them relatively simple so that they can keep the prices down. And they're perfectly functional backyard beaters. This is a fine sword. It's not a great handling sword by any means. That's not to say this is a terribly handling sword. It's not. It's just not a particularly agile sword. It's not a particularly great handling sword. And now it's time to talk bottom line. This sword sells for roughly $300. Is it worth it? Well, for me, I would say probably not. I think it's actually a pretty decent sword. You know, it's fun to use, it is effective as a cutter, but it's a bit clunky, it's a bit heavy. There's enough historical inaccuracies about it that it's just not quite there for me. And this sword used to sell for, I believe, around $200, and there, yeah, I would say it would be worth it. I think it would even be worth it at $250. But getting up to around $300, it's just getting a little too pricey for my taste for what you get. And that's going to bring this series on Type 14 swords to a close. I hope you enjoyed it. Now personally, I didn't find any of the three swords to be quite to my taste. The Kingston Arms came closest, but that problem with the blade not sitting in the crossguard, that's a deal breaker for me. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to keep looking for more Type 14 swords. Maybe an Albion Sheriff, Yeoman, or Sovereign would do it. But in any case, thank you for watching, and until my next review, Alien 2 out.